So there's a movement around the nation, and I guess every year there are a bunch of different areas, different states, different cities that decide to not observe Columbus Day and instead have something called Indigenous Peoples Day, which makes 100% sense because Christopher Columbus was a really terribly, garbage human being who as we'll get into here, it was just somebody who was a horrible person on all accounts. Now, for some reason, Steven Crowder and Prager University, and I use university because that's what they call themselves, but of course they're not accredited. But anyways, Steven Crowder and PragerU, for some reason, decided it's a good idea to take this on as if it's something that should be important to them, which I don't understand why. And there is going to be an underlying, overarching conspiracy theory involved in this as well, as they always do. So check this out and we'll come back and talk about it.
Thanksgiving, Independence Day, Memorial Day. Holidays are a great time to riddle Americans with needless oppressive guilt. But the one that stands head and shoulders above the rest is Columbus Day. The day where progressives indoctrinate your children into believing Columbus to be Satan incarnate, the USA to be his evil spawn, and the Native Americans to be pacifists. And so now we have Indigenous Peoples Day. Or as it would have been named 30 years ago, Aboriginals Day. Or as it would have been named 10 or 15 years ago, Native Americans Day. Or as it could be named tomorrow in Canada, First Nation Peoples Day. Feeling the urge to self-inflict grievous bodily harm yet? That's only natural because the whole charade has become an exercise in hating Western civilization, which is really just an exercise in hating yourself. First, as far as Columbus goes, the guy deserves some credit, right? Flawed, to be sure, but he was the greatest navigator of his age, the first person to cross the Atlantic from the continent of Europe, and he did so without any maps and only 3 small ships. If you can name them, by the way, comment below, as I'm sure your professor can't. But your professor probably has taught you the tale of Columbus as a villain, usually as a starting off point to indict the United States as a whole, often relying on a few key myths and some pivotal lies by omission. So, to start with, I'll bet that you probably believe Columbus and other European settlers to simply have committed mass genocide against Native Americans, indigenous. But here's the truth. While there were many examples of brutal warfare between Europeans and Native Americans, neither side actually committed genocide. In fact, there was never an outright policy of Indian extermination. The Native Americans were mostly wiped out through infectious diseases that the settlers had inadvertently brought with them. Of the estimated 250,000 natives in Hispaniola, Columbus's first stop in the Americas in 1492, new infectious diseases wiped out a staggering 95% of their population by 1517. As far as genocide by violence, you can look at any historical account of even the most one-sided battles and find that they were still just that, battles. Take Wounded Knee, although hundreds of years later I only bring it up because I know that if I don't, you will. It's become ubiquitous with the idea of Native American genocide. After all, there were 150 to 350 Aboriginals killed or wounded. That's terrible. But there were also 25 American soldiers killed and 39 wounded. That's not genocide. That's a one-sided beatdown with Old Glory wielding the hammer. And sometimes the massacres went the other direction. See the Apaches for reference, or the Comanches, or a dozen or so other tribes. So the natives often gave as good as they got. Not exactly the way genocide usually tends to work. Here's another thing I bet you've been made to believe. That many Native Americans, American Indians, I don't know what, take your pick, lived in harmony with the environment until Columbus arrived and European settlers destroyed the land with their evil technology. Truth, not only did the natives brutally take out people, but they took out entire forests and hunted species to extinction. Squatting Bear and his First Nation buddies weren't hopping into kayaks to block whaling ships, probably because they were too busy killing seals to waterproof their kayaks. You also probably believe that the Native American, two-spirited First Nation something or other culture was a beautiful, pantheistic one of peace. The truth is, not so much. When Columbus arrived, the islands were inhabited by 2 main tribes. The Arawaks, who were passive and friendly, and the Caribs, who were vicious cannibals. The Arawaks actually lived in fear of the Caribs for, you guessed it, the reasons being that they hunted them down to enslave them and eat them. Yes, eat them. Ironically, we get the name Caribbean Islands from those famous people eaters. The only way settlers were able to conquer this land was through the help of Native Americans who teamed up with them to settle the score with other tribes who were even bigger jerks than they were. That's not even to mention the populations in Central and South America famous for ritual human sacrifice. You think Cortez was able to command and conquer with only 500 or so conquistadors? Of course not. It took 50,000 screaming, angry allied natives who'd had it up to here with being tortured, enslaved, and forced to carry gold for the other native Aztecs. At some point, they decided to roll the dice and go with the guys sporting funny beards and metal hats. None of this is to say that the early settlers were perfect, or that they didn't carry out their fair share of pretty scummy stuff, but to use America's mistakes as the brush with which to paint the entirety of its history while completely ignoring the indigenous lifestyle of barbarism and borderline evil is inaccurate at best, dishonest at worst. There were plenty of bloody, horrendous battles between the Europeans and the Indians. When a Neolithic tribe encounters a more technologically advanced people, the guys with the boom-boom sticks usually win. Columbus is not the issue here, and never was. This whole Indigenous Peoples Day charade is about teaching your children to despise Western civilization and anybody who dare defend it. But, then again, that could just be my Western civ privilege talking. Happy Columbus Day. I'm Stephen Crowder for Prager University.
So no, Christopher Columbus was a horrible, horrible human being. Not only was he a piece of shit, but he was also somebody who sucked at what he did. So he says like he was the best explorer of his age. Like, dude, first of all, there were already people living in the Americas, so it was already founded, and there had already been explorers who had gone to the Americas. So how was he a good explorer? He didn't even get to where his aim was. His whole purpose, he thought he was in India, and he didn't even know where he landed. On what planet is a lucky break something that is supposed to be like, oh man, you're such a great explorer, you ended up in a place that you completely didn't mean to end up in and didn't even know existed? You are truly a great explorer. No, like people had already had found it, and also explorers had, and there were already people living there. So that doesn't make sense. But here's a quote that I wanted to read you guys that he wrote in his journal. This goes into the depths of how shitty of a human being Christopher Columbus was. So here's what his quote from the journal says. It says, quote, "The Indians are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." So right there, just that quote alone, right? He's a shitty human being. He's a piece of garbage. Everyone should be able to admit that because it is the truth. This man not only was somebody who, as that already said, his aim was to subjugate, Native Americans, and that's what he ended up doing, but he found a weakness, what was perceived as a weakness from him, in which the Native Americans literally showed their hospitality, their courtesy, their very overt gratitude, niceness, I want to say. So they were being really good people to him. And instead of being like, oh man, wow, these are really good people, he's like, oh man, how can I subjugate these people who are being that, like, anybody who says something like that, how could you possibly say that, oh, what they did was good, they're a good person? Because they're not. Christopher Columbus was a complete douche. He was a complete douchebag. And the fact that we're still, that it's still going on today as like the day continues, it's insane, because he doesn't deserve to be in any way revered, because he sucked at what he did, because he failed in reaching his goal. He got lucky. He had a lucky break in which he failed to do what he actually set out to do. And the place that he so-called, quote-unquote, discovered was a place that multiple explorers before him had already found. And on top of that, there were already thousands of people living there. So how is that being a good explorer? What? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. And on top of that, as I explained, he's legitimately a horrible human being. He is a horrific person. As soon as he came in, he literally took advantage of them. He took them. he with the Lucans, I believe it was, he took them hostage and raped them and did crazy shit. It tortured them. It was disgusting, man. Christopher Columbus is a horrible human being. And the sad thing is that this video that Steven Crowder with PragerU did, it's all based on this fundamental conspiracy theory, which is that there's this, oh man, these lefties on college campuses want you to believe that Western civilization sucks. No, you fucking idiot. The whole idea is we need to make Western civilization better. So we need to admit the faults that happened so that we cannot make that same mistake in the future. Why on planet Earth would you revere and celebrate someone who sucked at his job, which was being an explorer? He fucking sucked. He failed epically. Epic proportions. He failed to do his mission. He came into a place he thought was India, but there were already explorers who had discovered it, and there were thousands of people living there. So how the fuck are you? You didn't discover shit. There's been people there and people who explored it before you, so you didn't find shit. You didn't discover jack shit. And that's the truth. And on top of that, there's just this, cringy way that Steven Crowder makes fun of the Native American or Indian or stuff like. Dude, there's nothing to make fun of. Like, I don't understand what, that's so cringy. It's not funny. I'm not laughing. You're not Dave Chappelle. You're not funny. You're not funny. It's just not, it's not funny. It's so fucking cringy, man. You are the worst comedian on the entire planet. You are the worst comedian to have ever existed on planet Earth. And I want to also add to, as the conclusion to this, Christopher Columbus should be given one thing and one thing only. He was a innovator when it comes to slavery, because he innovated essentially the system. Because after he found out that he could subjugate them, what happened after that? All of the other countries started subjugating, enslaved, tortured, and just completely fucked the Native Americans up. And so he was an innovator in that field because he found a whole new peoples for all the world. Like literally France, all the other countries, England, they all started colonizing and enslaving Native Americans. So that's what he should be gifted with. That is what he should be given credit for, as being a slave innovator. He is not somebody who we should be in any way, shape, or form celebrating. And if you think that we should be celebrating Christopher Columbus, you're probably a dumb fuck.